Welcome to our channel, Bravo News. $1.3 million loan default could destroy everything before Steve Sr.'s sentencing, the storm before the verdict. The humid Missouri air carried a tension that felt heavier than the gathering summer clouds above Gallatin. At McBee Farms, a place once buzzing with machinery, laughter, and confidence, silence now stretched across the acres of land. Inside the farmhouse office, Steve McBee Sr. sat slumped behind his desk, his rugged face lined with exhaustion. His once proud hands trembled slightly as he stared at a stack of papers spread before him. Foreclosure notices, loan statements, and legal warnings, each letter confirming the nightmare he'd been trying to outrun. Final notice. McBee Farms has officially defaulted on its $1.3 million agricultural loan. Those words echoed like a gunshot in his mind. For decades, McBee Farms had been his life's work, his identity, his legacy. And now, just 3 weeks before his federal fraud sentencing, he faced the possibility of losing everything. Steve leaned back, letting out a ragged sigh. "He built this from nothing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "And now, they're gonna take it all." But as the patriarch of the McBee dynasty, surrender wasn't in his nature. This wasn't just about the farm. This was about his family, his reputation, and the future of everything they had fought to build. The family meeting. By sunset, the entire McBee clan had gathered inside the massive farmhouse kitchen, a place that had hosted countless celebrations, but now felt like the stage for a war council. Stephen Jr. sat stiffly at the table, arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he might snap. Jesse, his younger brother, leaned against the counter, scrolling anxiously on his phone, while Cole sat in silence, staring into his untouched glass of sweet tea. Their mother, Christy, paced the floor like a restless storm cloud, occasionally shooting sharp glances at Steve Sr. "Tell us this isn't true," Stephen Jr. demanded, his voice low but loaded with anger. "Tell us we're not about to lose the farm." Steve Sr. hesitated, his silence saying more than any words could. Christy slammed her hands against the table. "Damn it, Steve, you promised this was handled. You told me the bank was working with us." Steve ran his hand over his face, exhaling slowly. "I thought they would, but they've had enough. We're in default, Chris, and with the sentencing coming up," he trailed off, unable to finish. "Great, so Dad's possibly going to prison, the farm's going under, and we're about to become reality TV's biggest joke." "Don't you dare," Stephen Jr. snapped, glaring at him. "This isn't about TV. This is about our name. This is about everything Dad built." The kitchen erupted in shouting, anger, blame, and fear all boiling over. But beneath the noise, Steve Sr. remained silent, his expression grim. He knew something they didn't. The secret deal. 2 nights later, Steve Sr. was driving alone down a dusty back road under a heavy Missouri moon. He wasn't headed home. He wasn't going to the courthouse. He was meeting a man who could make the $1.3 million problem disappear. The meeting spot was an old abandoned grain elevator on the edge of town. A black pickup truck idled nearby, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Inside sat Rick Dalton, a powerful local investor with deep pockets and even deeper secrets. Rick had been circling McBee Farms for years, waiting for the moment the family became desperate enough to take his offer. "You're late," Rick said flatly. Steve exhaled, standing tall despite the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I didn't come here to beg," he said. "I came here to make a deal." Rick smirked. "Good, because I don't give handouts, Steve. I buy things. And right now, your farm is bleeding out." The offer was brutal. Rick would cover the $1.3 million default, but in exchange, he'd gain 40% ownership of McBee Farms, forever changing the dynasty's control. Steve clenched his fists. Selling off nearly half the farm to a man like Rick was a betrayal of everything the McBee name stood for. But with sentencing around the corner and the banks closing in, he had no choice. Or so he thought. The betrayal. Back at the farmhouse, Stephen Jr. overheard his father's late-night phone call with Rick. "You're giving him control?" Stephen's voice thundered from the doorway. Steve froze, his eyes locking on his son. "I'm doing this for the family," he said carefully. "If I don't, we lose everything." "No, Dad," Stephen shot back, his voice shaking with fury. "If you do this, we lose ourselves." The argument stretched deep into the night, ripping at wounds that had never fully healed. The McBee brothers took sides, Christy slammed doors, and for the first time in years, the family faced the possibility of breaking apart not because of outsiders, but because of each other. Judgment Day. 3 weeks later, the courthouse in Kansas City was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious locals. The air was thick with whispers as Steve Sr. stepped through the doors, his family trailing behind him like shadows. The sentencing hearing was brutal. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulator who played the system for personal gain, while the defense fought to portray him as a hard-working farmer crushed by financial pressures. When the judge finally spoke, the room went silent. "Stephen McBee Sr.," he said, his voice deep and steady, "this court hereby sentences you." A scream erupted from the hallway before the sentence could be read. A bank official stormed into the courtroom, waving documents. "Your Honor," he shouted, "McBee Farms has just been seized by the bank." Gasps filled the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Steve Sr.'s head dropped into his hands. In one crushing moment, the McBee dynasty wasn't just shaken, it was shattered. After the fall, the courthouse steps were swarmed with flashing cameras, microphones, and chaos. The news of McBee Farms' foreclosure had spread like wildfire, and reporters shouted over each other for a statement. Christy clutched Stephen Jr.'s arm, trying to push through the crowd. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, but her anger burned brighter than ever. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath, gripping Steve Sr.'s sleeve. "You hear me, Steve? You're not taking us down with you." Steve barely heard her. His ears rang with fragments of the judge's final words. He'd been spared immediate prison time but placed on house arrest until a final financial review. That small mercy felt meaningless. Without the farm, without control, he wasn't sure who he even was anymore. Reporters screamed questions. "Steve, did you commit fraud? Is McBee Farms gone for good? What happens to your reality show now?" Stephen Jr. shoved one microphone away, his jaw tight with restrained fury. "Back off!" he barked, his voice shaking. But as the family piled into their black SUV, there was no escaping reality. The McBee name, once synonymous with success, wealth, and power, was now tied to scandal, failure, and public humiliation. Rick Dalton's takeover. 3 days later, a convoy of black trucks pulled into McBee Farms. At the front was Rick Dalton, the man Steve Sr. had secretly negotiated with. He stepped out in a tailored black suit, sunglasses shielding his expression, flanked by lawyers and private security. His mere presence on the land felt like a violation. "Afternoon, McBees," Rick said coolly, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'll keep this short. I now own 40% of this farm. As of this morning, I'm restructuring operations." Stephen Jr. stormed forward, fists clenched. "You snake! You're not taking control of this family's legacy." Rick smirked, lowering his shades just enough to meet Stephen's furious gaze. "Son, legacy doesn't pay the bills. Ownership does." Christy stepped between them, her voice sharp as broken glass. "This is our home. Our blood is in this soil. You'll never take that away." Rick leaned in, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Christy, sweetheart, I already have." Her chest tightened, but she refused to let him see her break. Instead, she turned to Steve Sr., her voice trembling with restrained rage. "You made this deal? And you didn't tell us?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Steve lowered his head, guilt flooding his features. "I was trying to save us." "You didn't save us," she spat. "You sold us." Brothers at war. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary, had turned into a war zone. Stephen Jr. and Jesse, usually inseparable, now barely spoke without shouting. Jesse, always the pragmatic one, sided with their father, believing Rick Dalton was the only way to keep McBee Farms alive. "Think about it, Steve," Jesse said, slamming his fist on the table. "Without Rick, the bank takes everything. At least this way we still have land. We still have something." Stephen Jr. shot up from his chair, eyes blazing. "Something? Jesse, he's gutting us. He'll bleed this farm dry and throw us out when he's done." Cole, the youngest brother, sat quietly, his anxiety written across his face. "Guys, please, we're tearing ourselves apart." Christy, leaning against the doorway, watched her sons fight with a breaking heart. The McBee dynasty wasn't just collapsing under financial ruin, it was collapsing from the inside. And yet, deep down, she knew something none of them did. She had her own plan. Christy's secret plan. Late one night, after everyone had gone to bed, Christy slipped into her private office, locking the door behind her. She opened her laptop and pulled up a string of encrypted emails. For weeks, she'd been quietly reaching out to potential investors, people who hated Rick Dalton as much as she did. She wasn't going to let her family's name or their land be destroyed without a fight. Her secret ally? Caleb Masters, a wealthy cattle magnate and Rick Dalton's longtime rival. Their emails were blunt. "Christy, Dalton owns 40%, but I can undermine him if I can raise enough capital. I need 1.5 mm. Fast." Caleb, "If you're willing to go to war, Christy, I'll fund you, but you'd better be ready to play dirty." Christy's hands shook as she typed her reply. "I've never been more ready in my life." For the first time in weeks, a fire burned in her chest. Rick Dalton thought he'd won, but Christy McBee was about to prove him wrong. The whistleblower. Just when the McBee family thought things couldn't get worse, an anonymous email landed in Stephen Jr.'s inbox. Subject: "You're being set up." The message contained scanned documents, contracts, loan agreements, and secret memos proving that Rick Dalton had been working with the bank to sabotage McBee Farms for months. It was all there in black and white. Rick had bribed a senior loan officer to accelerate foreclosure, forcing Steve Sr. into desperation so he could buy the farm at a discount. Stephen Jr. rushed into the living room, shoving the papers at his father. "Look at this! He played you! This wasn't bad luck. It was a setup." Steve stared at the documents, his hands trembling. His shame turned into fury. "We take this to court," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Rick Dalton is not going to steal this family from me." But Rick wasn't going down without a fight. Showdown at McBee Farms. By dawn, Rick Dalton arrived at the farm with his lawyers and security team, prepared to take full operational control. Instead, he found the McBee family, united for the first time in weeks, standing at the gates with cameras rolling. Local news crews had been tipped off by Christy herself. Christy stepped forward, holding up the incriminating documents. "Rick Dalton, you've been caught red-handed. Bribery, fraud, extortion. We're taking this to federal court." Rick's smirk faltered for the first time. "You think you can beat me?" he said coldly. Christy leaned in, her voice like steel. "I don't think, Rick. I know." The crowd erupted as reporters swarmed, snapping photos and shouting questions. Rick, realizing the trap he had walked into, turned on his heel and stormed back to his truck. For the first time, the McBees had a fighting chance. The final twist. 2 weeks later, just as the family began rebuilding their fractured empire, a letter arrived from the federal court. It wasn't about Rick Dalton. It was about Steve Sr.'s sentencing. The judge had reviewed new financial evidence tying Steve to offshore accounts connected to the very fraud charges he thought he'd escaped. His heart sunk as he read the words. Due to new findings, your sentencing has been rescheduled. Immediate federal custody required. Christy dropped the letter on the table, her hands shaking. The room fell silent. The farm might be saved. The family might be stronger. But Steve Sr.? He was going to prison. And as the sun set over Gallatin, the McBee dynasty faced a chilling reality. The real battle was only beginning. Thanks for watching the video. Please subscribe to our channel for regular updates.